there folks, this is Dan Fagella here with another CLV Boost tutorial, this time around the topic of newsletter marketing from a strategic perspective. So quickly what we're going to be covering in this brief training today, we're going to talk about what is a newsletter versus an autoresponder in terms of our overall email marketing campaigns. We're going to talk about the 4 big picture questions to ask before writing a single newsletter and some layout examples that are worth considering. We're going to talk about driving return on investment, what to test and track with email newsletters. A lot of the time, return on investment is neglected, and we think of newsletters as a branding tool. Should not be the case, although branding might be a fun, happy side effect here. We really do want to focus on return on investment, make sure newsletters are driving key results. And we'll talk about exactly what we can drive and potentially how, as well as some useful newsletter examples to use and learn from. So I always like modeling the best. I like seeing what successful companies are doing. I leverage that knowledge for my own businesses, the businesses that we work with through CLV Boost, and I recommend the same for you. So I'm going to pull up some useful newsletter examples that will prompt ideas for calls to action, for content, for layout that you can use for your own business potentially right now, as well as some common errors to avoid, which will be useful for everyone to bear in mind as you send out your own newsletters. And when we get down to common errors to avoid, almost anyone who is sending out newsletters is doing one or more of them. So it's very important to stick around to the end of this particular training, because there's going to be some serious learnings there towards the end with respect to making significant changes to a lot of current email efforts that I know many of you are involved in. So I'm going to share some best practices today, and we'll move along. A preliminary warning here, okay? We're going to get into the bigger problems and where these sort of spur up and talk a little bit more specifically about them, but newsletters are often neglected as a sales retention tool and are sent out with no strategic thinking or emphasis on measurable results. And what is not measured cannot be managed. So taking the time and money to send out newsletters without a goal or measurement is like hiring salespeople and not training them. Newsletters exist for the bottom line and must be justified on that criteria. Anyone that is sending out newsletters to look like their company is still alive to their list is wasting a lot of time. And we ought to be thinking very strategically around how we're segmenting our newsletters, who's receiving them, and what we want those people to do. Do we want them to refer? Do we want them to call in and do more business? Do we want them to retain and to keep us top of mind for e-commerce purchases? What is the purpose? So I'm going to help clarify that thought process and give some useful examples today. But it's very important to understand that newsletters are really the neglected cousin of a traditional email marketing campaign. They're seen as sort of this last-ditch bucket effort, when in fact newsletters could and should be driving a solid percentage of revenue, particularly if we have a large prospect or customer list that we've either bought or acquired over the years or what have you. So bear that in mind as we move along. What's a newsletter? So we're going to talk about the difference between an autoresponder and a newsletter. I boiled it down to a couple bullet points each, so this makes things rather simple. An autoresponder is sent automatically based on a triggered event, such as downloading a white paper or making an initial purchase. These are pre-programmed. They're not scheduled out ad hoc, so they're not scheduled out randomly or scheduled out regularly. They're written once and then they kick out automatically. That is the nature of an autoresponder. Someone downloads a white paper and they get an email every 2 days for 3 weeks, whatever the case may be. And these are usually of greater frequency and more clearly driving to a call to action than a traditional newsletter is, okay? I recommend almost with every single business I work with, both leveraging the power of autoresponders and also having a regimen of newsletters and what we call broadcast messaging. So a broadcast kind of newsletter style messaging is normally sent out manually, usually on a designated and regular basis. So this might be weekly, monthly, etc. We'll talk a bit about frequency. And then often they're very timely. They're relating to news and updates of particular relevance to that time and to the people who are receiving it. They can be seen as a kind of content marketing for the inbox for your clients and prospects. But again, content marketing drives ROI. It doesn't exist just to say that we do content marketing. It exists to lift particular numbers that we can track. That's what we get hired for. That's what marketing people inside any business should be getting paid to do. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. 4 questions to contemplate. The first question I want to talk about here is segmentation. Before we even think about what the purpose of the email is, we have to think about who's getting it. And in general, the answer to that for a newsletter is, everyone, of course. All 120,000 of our customers, prospects, past customers, etc., are receiving the same broadcast. Well, that's not a great approach. because you're aiming for them to do different things. So a simple example would be, if we go by industry, maybe if you're a consulting firm and you work with hospitals and you work with healthcare companies and you also work with doctors associations or something along those lines, you may want to think about those particular industries and group clusters and what sort of news, updates, events, and services that you offer are relevant to those segments. Rather than sending an email where everybody who gets it says, well, about 20% of this is relevant to me. How about sending emails where 100% is relevant to the recipient? That would be a more ideal scenario. So by industry might be an answer to that, and then we can, if we're embedding soft or hard calls to action in the newsletter, then we can get more direct ROI in that particular respect. Push comes to shove and worse comes to worse, we can maintain a better relationship over time because people actually want to read our emails because they actually derive some real value from that. And assuming that remaining top of mind can help us stay engaged, plugged in, and connecting to those prospects, that's something that we might want to stay on top of. Similarly, buyer and prospect status. This is oftentimes the easiest for me to be able to step in and do with any given newsletter that is what I call vanilla, meaning it is a newsletter that gets sent to everyone. Normally, we want to be looking at sending buyers, current customers, and prospects a different kind of messaging. Because prospects, we want them to get a foot in the door and pay. When they are buyers, we either want them to buy again or we want to retain them. Normally, those fall into those categories. If we have a retention-based business like a software company or some kind of ongoing service, then we might want to segment into prospects, customers, and past customers. And past customers, we want to bring them into re-up. So we may send out broadcast messages that have very similar educational content, similar up-to-date news and relevant knowledge for the recipient, but a different call to action. We noticed that, and if you haven't tried our software yet, here's a great place to get a free trial. For all past customers, we're running a special in the month of June where we are whatever the case may be, a different CTA, a different call to action. We might be sending out a very similar message with a slightly different subject line. Past customers, why blank 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 is important this month. Whatever the case may be, and if you downloaded XYZ white paper, you need to read that, whatever the case may be. So we're going to market them differently. We're going to voice our subject line differently to buyers, prospects, and past customers. And we're also going to have a different CTA for those folks. Or we might do it by company size. If you're selling to B2B and you have to talk to the small guys differently than you do to the large fellas, then we might send out newsletters segmented by size of business in addition to industry, in addition to buying status. Normally, buying status is the easiest to do. Ultimately, this is a strategic decision made by the really sharp marketing folks and leading folks at whatever company is implementing the newsletter. But either way, this is, before we even think about the purpose of the email, we need to think about what different groups of our big old list of folks is going to be receiving this. It should not be one big group, which means everybody gets the same thing. It should be many smaller groups. Normally, we want to keep this reasonable. So between 2 and 4 groups for broadcast messaging is often more than reasonable and can lift the return on investment, the money made from broadcast messaging and newsletter messaging significantly. So think about segmentation first. Next up, we want to think about what is the measurable ROI metric here per segment, okay? If you run a software company and you do not offer additional services or products, then if someone is already a customer, you are not trying to sell them something else. You are trying to retain them. You are trying to increase stick. You are trying to keep them around for a long time. You're trying to show them best practices. Get them embedded. Get them using your software on a day-to-day basis. Get them getting other people on the team to use the software. Make it a part of their culture. And retention is the core driver there. If you're looking at prospects, then we're looking for initial front-end offers. Offers to get them in the door. Offers to get them on the phone, whatever the case may be. So what is the measurable ROI per segment? Is it appointments booked? Is it e-commerce sales? Is it engagements with your app or product? Retention, as we mentioned for software. Is it direct referrals? Are you sending out educational content that these folks can forward around that often maybe will result in a different appointment from somebody else sharing this kind of a knowledge? Is that something that you can measure and track in some way, shape, or form? You should certainly have call tracking on any phone numbers listed in your email, especially if you have, again, a larger email list and either prospects or customers, just so you can ensure, hey, if they're calling from within the email, we should be able to track that. And again, this may differ per customer segment. Your current customers for a software company are going to be about retention. Your past customers are going to be about re-engaging, and your prospects are going to be about that foot in the door initial purchase. And if you broke it up by industry, different industries might purchase different products, or with one industry, you want to sell e-com, another industry, you want to get them on the phone because they're bigger ticket and you want a sales guy on them. Whatever the case may be, we have to be thinking about, if we say, what is the purpose of our broadcast messaging? It's impossible to define that unless we think about segmentation first. So what is ROI per segment? So once you have your segments, let's think about what do we really want to drive in terms of return on investment. When I send out this email, I want to see more blank. Fill in that blank with what is the most reasonable metric for return on investment for that email message. Next, what is the communication frequency per segment? Twice weekly in many sort of B2C kind of consumer hobby-ish type niches is more than reasonable. There's a lot of newsletters and very sharp marketers, B2C, who are much more frequent than that, even if you'll believe it, and we've seen it be more than profitable. If you're doing B2B, generally we're less frequent, and you sort of have to put yourself in the shoes of who's receiving it. And so if this is something that this person loves, if you're selling hiking gear and things about hiking, if you're again, normally if we're talking about something that's affinity and fun and hobby, we can be communicating all the time with educational content, potentially offers, etc. And it may really not get on folks' nerves. However, if we're selling face cream, for example, whatever segment of the female population is going to be buying face cream probably doesn't want to be hearing about it every single day. I mean, if you can disguise it with content marketing and other beauty and health tips, maybe that's relevant, but you're most likely looking at less frequency than a pure hobby or affinity kind of a niche. If you're going B2B, normally we might even be a little bit less frequent than that. So I recommend twice weekly, weekly, or monthly. Here's my proposition. Anyone that says, we'll have a quarterly newsletter, in general, that is laziness. And in general, I very rarely would come across an instance where I would say quarterly would be better than monthly. If you would say, well, monthly's too often, I really think they'd opt out and they wouldn't like it. Well, if that's the case, are they going to be less annoyed by a quarterly email? My argument is they'd probably be just as annoyed if they're going to be annoyed in the first place, and they're just as likely to opt out, and they're more likely to forget who the heck you are if it's been 90 days since the last time they heard from you. So quarterly newsletter emails, I think, is often laziness. I'd very much recommend monthly when folks really believe that their newsletter should be more spaced out. So weekly and monthly is normally what we're toggling with. Occasionally, twice weekly is relevant for newsletter communication. And assuming we have a list that justifies it, again, this is a pretty thick driver of re-upping past customers, of retaining current customers, and of getting initial front-end purchases or front-end appointments from current prospects who've not yet converted. Newsletters can be a very powerful tool for that, but weekly or monthly is normally what we're toggling between. Also, what will be the format and tone? So these are just considerations to think about. Not as important as segmentation, not as important as what you're tracking, but they are important considerations before putting together your newsletters. Is it going to be a more personal tone and touch? Is it going to be a little bit more corporate? Banner with logo at the top, etc., etc. Are we going to focus on one piece of content or maybe many different pieces of content and points of emphasis? Are we going to have pictures, graphics? Is it going to be simple or text-based? And really, remember, we're going to use the segments, we're going to use the ROI drivers to really determine how we answer these questions. If video is conducive to selling what we're trying to sell or helping to retain the folks that are using our software, then maybe video is the case. If pictures and graphics or a podcast would do a better job for whatever reason and from whatever knowledge we have from our prospects, then maybe we will use that. But these are important considerations. Just some ideas for format. Some folks might just have a main picture or video up at the top and then just some short text, a little bit more kind of personal. Some folks might have a major piece of content and then a couple other relevant news or educational chunks underneath there. Some folks might just have a whole big old list of news, updates, offers, whatever the case may be, and it may be very much sort of a la carte style of an email. We're going to see an example of that from a very successful company called Wayfair, which is currently doing $1 billion a year in rev at the time of this recording. So they're worth modeling for any folks who are out there in e-com, and they're worth modeling just in general because they're a rather successful company actually right here in the Boston area. And then number 4 here, we have a little bit more of a personal email, more just kind of short text, couple paragraphs, a little bit of a picture. Maybe that's a video somebody can click. We might include a link or two in that particular email. Again, a little bit more of a personal flair and flavor. We're going to see an example of that from HubSpot, another successful company locally. Moving along, what to track and test. So things that we'll want to maintain tracking and testing of over time will be our open rates, our click-through rates, our stick rates overall. So what is the percentage of drop-off? Most people have an emotional attachment to if people opt out of their email list. Please do not have an emotional attachment to that. Have an emotional attachment to your bottom line. I just sort of recommend that as it's more important than other things. But either way, stick rate is worth considering how long folks are going to hang out. And then is it possible to track forwarding with some software? It is. And then ultimately what we're really aiming to track here is the bottom line. E-commerce purchases, phone calls, and appointments driven specifically from email marketing and from newsletter and broadcast marketing. And when we're doing split tests, for example, if we have 2 different newsletters, we have a buyer's and we have a prospect's newsletter, and we send out 3 months worth of newsletters, if we have the functionality and the software capability, and this is really depending on the list size that we're working with, it's depending on the number of folks we're talking to, maybe the sophistication of the software we're using, we ought to be split testing subject lines, split testing formats, split testing calls to action in order to determine what tends to hit hardest with our different segments. So when we're testing, we are testing format, call to action, media, all of those factors to see what ultimately moves these bottom line factors, which is what we're talking about. So ultimately, we should be split testing newsletter communication if at all possible. Again, the ROI drivers, things that we can toggle here, factors that we can toggle in order to aim to yield more specific return on investment from newsletter communication. Do we go for a hard versus a soft call to action? A hard call to action in a newsletter would be, this month we're running a special on blah, 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 blah. That would be a hard call to action. Nothing wrong with it, by the way. A softer call to action is a blog post that has to do with a particular piece of educational content, and then at the bottom of that blog post is a mention of a consulting service for that same sort of topic that you were teaching in the educational video. So you taught an educational video about how hospitals can save money with using accounting services or accounting strategies, and then you have a free consultation that hospitals can use. So soft would be really embedding an offer sort of behind content marketing, having very subtle potential cues to allow people to make a step in the door. More hard ROI driving approach for a newsletter would be explicitly asking for the order or explicitly having a call to action that's very strong. Usually this is done directly in the email. Sometimes it's even done in the subject line itself. Do we have many versus few calls to action? So HubSpot versus Wayfair. We're going to look at them as examples of email formats, and we're going to get into some successful examples or examples from successful companies, I should say, that will glean some new ideas for the folks out there who are looking for better and new ideas for newsletter communication. Media choices: video, image, text, audio. If we're, we can split test newsletter variations with video, newsletter variations that are a lot more text oriented, newsletter variations that involve audio if that's for some reason a piece of your business, and newsletters that maybe do not. So media choice may be a toggle switch that we can leverage in order to drive more return on investment. And then at the bottom here, how to mix in news and education into your true calls to action. So this ties in a little bit to are we going with hard or soft calls to action? But it's a way of thinking about, okay, how do we make this a newsletter, something up to date, something educational, something useful to read and listen to and watch and consume, but at the same time, ultimately be able to move the needle on things that sort of matter for revenue, which of course we're all really into, being as we're in business. Newsletter examples. So now we're going to hop out of my slideshow here and go into some PDF saved examples from various companies who are leveraging the power of newsletters specifically to drive sales. All right, so here we are in a few PDF examples of potential newsletters. I don't happen to like the subject line on this newsletter from BCG, which is Boston Consulting Group, and we'll speak to that a bit here in errors to avoid. But they do have a very sort of corporate feel here, and as you can see, this is a very much ad hoc, unfortunately a little bit more blanket than I'd usually like, but a bit of an ad hoc pick what you'd like educational content type broadcast. So they have a number of different thought leadership type articles, which is common for consulting companies, and they allow folks to be able to select. So they have different sections here: the public sector, marketing and sales, consumer and retail, different groups that they focus their consulting on, some social calls to action, and this nice branding thing going on down here. It would be very nice if we knew who was interested in BCG's perspectives on just marketing and sales, and they receive just marketing and sales related content. But in this particular case, it's a little bit more broad, a little bit more ad hoc, a little bit more general exposure to thought leadership, no real succinct call to action. But again, if for them, they find that content marketing and thought leadership are most conducive for them, which maybe they have, this may be a format that works out well for them. Who knows how much strategy went into it on the back end, but it certainly is a useful format, and there's many other companies that might want to consider this sort of a overall educational thought leadership type positioning newsletter. There's plenty of other examples, but this is a great example from BCG, and they're obviously a rather sharp company. Another example here from Wayfair. Wayfair sells home goods on the internet to the tune of $1 billion a year, and this is their subject line: make yourself at home with our favorite ways to shop, Wayfair. So here they're providing a particular coupon, very particular call to action. As you can see, this is what we call a hard CTA. They are what we would say not playing games with their email here. And they're an e-commerce company, so they're aiming to drive to the website. They're aiming to push the discounts. They're aiming to get that inventory out the door and make their sales. So this is a very much, they got the nice big pictures, 65% off. This is all a big call to action for a variety of different products. So Wayfair, when I signed up for their newsletter, they don't know what I'm interested in. Now, I might argue they'd be better off if they knew how big my apartment was, what I was interested in buying, how big my house was, how many rooms and bedrooms I have. But they don't know any of that, so they're just sending me a large swath of offers. And again, they're doing $1 billion a year, so it's good enough. It's not as targeted as I would like, and I'm sure they would more than admit to that. But their conversion rates on just email might do that much better, that it makes sense for them to send a larger ad hoc sort of an email like this. So if you're in e-com, it's worth tuning into Wayfair if you're doing anything less than $1 billion a year and getting a sense for what their newsletters look like, getting a sense for what their CTAs, what their discounts, what their coupon offers look like, and how they're positioning and framing newsletter type marketing. In addition here, this is a little bit of newsletter action from HubSpot. HubSpot allows you to subscribe to different sections of their blog. So if you just want to hear about sales, then they'll just tell you about sales. So this is their subject line: Inside Sales Benchmark Report reveals what your SaaS sales team needs to know. So they don't know that I'm a software as a service or not, but I suppose they are making the bold proposition that I am. Either way, this is specifically sales oriented because that's the section of their newsletter or the section of their blog I decided to sign up for. And in this particular case, they're driving to a particular article. So a new article comes out, they send out a particular broadcast to the folks that said they wanted to be subscribed to that kind of an article. So here we see a relatively personable email. It's sent from corporate. It's not sent from Jane Stevens. It's sent from a blog at HubSpot. So it's not they're not aiming to be too personal here, but it's got a little bit of a personal tone, a little bit of a personal look and feel. One very simple CTA, which is getting them right to the SaaS benchmarks, and HubSpot will use their, so they're aiming for a direct referral. They're also aiming for folks to probably take them up on a direct CTA, which is a call to action on their article. So at the bottom of their article, I can basically guarantee you that there is a call to action to talk to HubSpot, get a trial of their software, whatever the case may be, to sell. Their purpose, of course, as is any business, is to do just that. So this is an example of how they do it, and this is an example of how they've made the determination that they should send me sales content because I subscribe specifically for that. So they have some segmentation here. HubSpot does that rather well. Mercola, another e-commerce company, one of many, but an e-commerce company that sells a variety of different health supplements and what have you. This guy's been on Dr. Oz and makes a solid X number of $1 million per year for quite some time, and leverages email marketing rather heavily. I think it's a little bit busy, but here we see a lot of content around particular health topics. Again, there's a specific CTA, there's a specific curiosity factor. Ignoring this inflammatory early warning signal could cost your life. Very, very strong sort of nervousness factor that they're inducing there to get the open. But then when you land, it's a little bit all over the place in terms of educational content. But I think the layout is potentially worthwhile and worth considering and split testing for some of the folks out there. And again, these folks do a pretty good job to the tune of, I'm not too far from $1 million a month selling online. So they have, again, links to social profiles. They have particular products being featured, your recommended products. Unfortunately, all I gave this guy was my email address, so these recommendations aren't as strong as I would like them to be, but they are recommendations nonetheless. And we have some specific offers and CTAs, and we have educational content. So another example of a layout, another example of how they do their header and banner. You can see if that's useful for your company compared to the other examples of headers, banners, and branding that we've seen in emails, but this is just another potential example to contemplate. We have another one here from lynda.com. Lynda is a website that teaches various skills on the internet. They teach you how to code, they'll teach you how to sell, they'll teach you how to manage your time. So this subject line was called Get Things Done, Explore Video, Hardware, and Start Drawing. I'm actually not so sure. Sort of 3 different educational topics that they're touching on here. A little bit random in terms of a subject line, but they may very well have tested this newsletter regardless. June newsletter. So this is what they're sending. Get things done. So who knows how they're segmenting? They don't know anything about me other than my email address, so not very well. But Lynda, I have nothing but respect for the company. Just saying I'm not getting a rather segmented email here. So they're promoting this particular course. Become a member, right? Is that a hard or a soft call to action? Sort of a rhetorical question. Also in this issue, yada, 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 a whole bunch of additional links you can check out if you're interested. And then they have another big video, how you can learn from this course. Another video, how you can learn from this course. Very specific. Learn this, buy the course, learn this, buy the course, sign up, sign up, sign up, sign up. So, but it's still content because they're educating you about the courses. They're sending you to videos to learn more about the courses. They are providing useful educational content. They are providing a nice display of probably some of their more popular courses, and they are allowing other folks to sort of get a grasp and understanding therein. Again, interesting pictures, maybe worthwhile for clicking. Here we see a lot of content, though. As you can see, I'm scrolling down, going through a lot of content. And then let's see how they end it. So yeah, rather big email. This is pretty content heavy. who knows how much they're testing here, but it's something to contemplate in terms of format. I think it's a rather interesting approach that they're taking here. All right, moving along here into errors to avoid. One error that is actually not listed here that I want to make sure I mention, because I knew otherwise maybe I'd forget here, is titling your newsletter the same thing every month. By golly, that does nobody any good. If you say, your monthly update from blah, 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 such and such, man, on the aggregate, that will depress your response. In other words, that will get you less opens, less click-throughs over time as you repeatedly use the same headline. You want to be able to mix things up in the headline. Make things new, different, interesting, relevant, maybe fun from time to time, depending on your culture and your tone, which we had spoken to before. Do not have the same text in every broadcast message. Something along the lines of, your monthly update, your weekly update from, your weekly news. No. And maintaining a consistent format like that is a recipe for boredom. It is also a way to lull your readers to sleep and to depress your response over time. So in general, unless we have a very explicit reason to do so, do not title broadcast and newsletter emails in a similar fashion week by week and month by month. That is a not to do, not a to do. Next up here, unless you have a significant list size, do not send vanilla newsletters and hit everyone on your list in the same way. More or less at any given company that we'll walk initially into who does anything with newsletters of any significance, it is usually done with a big blanket vanilla messaging. Normally, we can lift return on investment, drive specific sales, and be able to show how they correlate directly from newsletters by just segmenting, just figuring out what particular education, what particular updates is useful to what segments, and then what offers can we offer each segment, and then send out 2 instead of 1 and immediately be able to see an ROI. Not all that uncommon at all, and more than useful for anybody tuned in with a list size of any significance. Do not write or send any broadcast message that does not have a succinct purpose, which ought to be tied to an inherent ROI driver. We talked about those before: retention, e-commerce, sales, appointments for sales folks, whatever the case may be. So there should be an overall marketing game plan and what metrics we're aiming to move. No broadcast should be sent out with the purpose of, we're still alive and we're a company and we look professional because we have a newsletter. That's a horrible excuse for what we like to call marketing, and we should really be thinking about marketing. Lastly here, you can think of newsletters as branding, but never allow branding to be an excuse for not tracking legitimate metric-moving results. So something to bear in mind, but more than worth bearing in mind moving forward. And lastly here, folks who want to get in touch with us at CLV Boost, in addition to doing a full-blown assessment of the quadrants of email marketing and marketing automation being leveraged in any given company, making recommendations on software, working with an existing software, optimizing systems for growth, for revenue, essentially making your marketing consummate to your ambition and making sure that it can scale with you, and then we can test and track all of those functions and assets. In addition to that, we'll also often work on particular projects. It's not all that uncommon that those particular projects have to do specifically with autoresponder campaigns, specifically with newsletter redesign and driving return on investment from newsletters. Folks with thousands of past customers that are having a very, very sloppy newsletter strategy can often lift monthly rev and get a consistent drive of new buyers or re-engagement of past buyers by simply implementing a better newsletter strategy. We're always happy to be able to chat about that for folks that might be a fit for our services, the kinds of companies with the kinds of ambitions that we like to work with. You can submit a project along those lines at clvboost.com/strategy if you're interested in working with us. Other than that, I hope that this educational session here was useful for everybody who's on the horn, and I look forward to catching up shortly.